Hello everyone. So in this short video I want to cover a few things that we didn't cover in the previous class with respect to Descartes. So a very quick review. We covered Descartes' methodological doubt, in which we saw, that he was looking for the most certain principle upon which he wants to base his knowledge and science ultimately, right? He becomes very influential in our modern science, as we've talked about. So we saw very quickly that in doubting everything, in his attempts to doubt everything, he reaches this critical point where he says the "I think, therefore I am" statement, which becomes very famous, and we saw that he meant it not so much as an argument, but as his first premise and/or the foundation for all the rest, right? And so he says, based on this discovery that his thinking, the fact that he's thinking is something that he cannot doubt, or that he cannot doubt he's existing because of his thought, he arrives at the idea that he's a thinking thing, a thinking being, that he also calls a soul. Now, the next principle that he discovers is that this is a clear and distinct idea, as he calls it, or something that's self-evident, we might say. So then he takes that as a principle then of knowledge, that which is clearly and distinctly perceived by the mind is true. So then he says, I'm going to ignore now everything that is not a clear and distinct idea. I'm going to ignore everything that's not completely clear to my mind or self-evident, right? Obvious in a sense, after some deep examination. And so he continues in his search, and he says, well, for me to get past the clear and distinct idea that I exist as a thinking substance, as a soul, that I can know the soul most of all, he says. From there, he wants to jump to, well, how do I get to the reality of the material world? And then he has to prove that his senses are not deceiving him. And then he realizes, perhaps because of the cultural context, that the best way to secure the validity of the senses, that there's an external world, is to prove that God actually exists and is good, right, or wouldn't deceive us. So he goes on to some arguments. The first one is a causal argument, and so is the second one. The third one we call a kind of ontological argument. Now, a few things that he's presupposing, or that he believes is true, that is the foundation of this argument, is one, something that is sometimes called the principle of sufficient reason. The principle of sufficient reason basically says everything either has a cause or an explanation. Everything either has a cause or an explanation. So a corollary to that, something that follows from that, is then the notion that nothing comes from nothing. In other words, everything must have an explanation or a cause. So if something exists, it must have come from something, right? Something must have caused it, or something must explain it. So that's the principle of sufficient reason. So upon this principle, he develops a more detailed argument for why God exists, and I'm providing some notes for you based on the text, on the idea of an infinitely perfect being that exists within us, right? And so he says we have some innate ideas. So he argues for this idea, or believes in the idea that there's innate ideas within us, right, that we're born with. Now, he says, well, look, I have the idea of an infinitely perfect being. So then he gives this 8-line proof, but I'm going to summarize it even more quickly. And the argument simply goes, well, look, if someone has an idea of an infinitely perfect being, then that idea must have an infinitely perfect cause. In other words, in the longer version of the proof, he basically articulates the idea that this concept could not have arisen in a finite being like himself, right? So he could not have been the cause of such an idea. Therefore, there must be a greater being in which that idea exists, or that explains that idea. In other words, yet again, the reality of that idea arising in us doesn't seem possible for him unless there's a higher being that causes that idea, because the effect must be equal to the cause in a sense, right? So that's another presupposition that he argues for. If there's an effect, the cause must be as real, have equal validity or ontological reality as the effect, right? So the cause and the effect must have a kind of parallel validity. So that's why he thinks that an infinite perfect being must be the cause of an infinitely perfect idea, or vice versa, right? The effect of an infinitely perfect idea must have an infinitely perfect cause, period. Therefore, he says, to finish the thought, I have an idea of an infinitely perfect being, therefore that idea must have an infinitely perfect cause, and that is what we call God. Next, he gives another argument, quite simple. Basically, he says, if something exists, then it must have a cause. Well, I exist, therefore I must have a cause. Then we add a last statement, which he argues for, and that is simply that God is the only possible cause to my existence. And he goes through a few different possibilities, as you'll see in the notes, and basically he goes through 4 options. Could I have been the cause of myself? That makes no sense. I'm not capable to produce myself. And secondly, he says, I would have made myself much more perfect, right? If I was the cause of my own existence. And then he goes into, could I have always existed? He says, well, that wouldn't explain my continual existence right now. Why do I exist right now or continue to exist? So that's not a good explanation either. Thirdly, he says, well, are my parents a good explanation? That leads to an infinite regress, because who created them, and then who created them, and so forth, ad infinitum to infinity. Then lastly, can something else less perfect than God have created me or the individual? He says that doesn't make sense either, because it couldn't account for the unity of the being or the complexity and so forth, right? And then the last option is God. So that's his options, that he basically says God is the best explanation for our existence, or for him existing. Lastly, we have the ontological argument, which I'm going to put very simply. God, by definition, is an infinitely perfect being. Existence is a perfection, because if you don't exist, then you can't be perfect. Therefore, God must exist, because as a perfect being, he must have the quality of existence. Another way to put it that might be clear is this. Of course, again, emphasizing the fact that existence is a perfection. In other words, no being could be perfect that lacked existence, right? That's part of the assumption. Basically, we could turn this into a kind of modus ponens. If there's a being that is infinitely perfect, that being must exist. God is an infinitely perfect being, therefore God exists. So that's a way that we could rephrase this sentence, or this argument rather, into a modus ponens argument. So for that, I hope you enjoyed this short presentation on his proofs for God. Now, does this solve the problem? Well, some people think that some of these arguments are good and valid, but there has not been consensus in some of these arguments, and you might find some flaws in these arguments yourself, right? Could you doubt some of these premises, are they clearly and distinctly perceived like he wants them to be? And if not, then we're actually stuck in the problem of skepticism again, right? And so this is some of the criticisms that people have of Descartes, in that he's trying to solve the problem of skepticism, but if he bases his skepticism or the solution to skepticism on the existence of God, then if these proofs don't work, then we still are stuck in skepticism. That's the problem. So then, for him at least, he thinks that he's proven God, and that therefore, if God is an infinitely perfect being, that means he's infinitely perfect good, infinitely perfectly good, omnipotent, and therefore wouldn't have the need to deceive us, and therefore we can trust our senses. But again, if you don't follow his arguments or like his arguments, then we're still stuck in the problem of skepticism. How do we know that the external world exists? Right? And this leads to a couple of hundreds of years of the problem of epistemology, actually, right? How do we know that we can know anything else besides our own thoughts? How do we know anything about the external world? How are we sure that our perceptions and our ideas actually are matching the reality out there? Or are we just stuck in our own ideas and our own thoughts, which is what we call solipsism, the idea that you can only be certain of your own perceptions and reality, what you perceive as reality, but you can't be sure that there's an actual reality out there matching your thoughts. So that's Descartes, who influences all of science and so forth, but philosophically leaves us with a few puzzles like the mind-body problem. How do we connect an immaterial substance to the material world? Or even worse, the problem of skepticism. How do we actually know that there's a material world out there? So in short, I hope you liked the video.